So here we are, Revelation chapter 8, the seventh seal, and of course it has to do with the prelude to the seven trumpets. Now, you need to remember, let me remind you, that Jesus took the scroll from him, the right hand from him who sits on the throne, from the Father, and that scroll was sealed with seven seals. Do you remember that? And so previously, we looked at what happened every time he opened a seal. And in Revelation chapter 6 and 7, we saw what happened when he opened up the first six seals. Now here, in Revelation chapter 8, verse 1, we read, when he opened the seventh seal, capital letter E, Jesus. He's in heaven, he has a scroll in his hand, and now John wants to know, and everybody wants to know, what is written on the scroll. The content of the scroll. But before, and it's written both sides on the scroll. He saw the words written both sides, but here's the problem. He says it is sealed with seven seals. And to see what is the content of the scroll, which contains the words of God concerning future events. These events to take place on earth from the church age through the 7-year tribulation, through the 7-year reign, through the great white throne judgment to the new earth and new Jerusalem, and the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. So before we could get there, and this is what's written on the scroll, he saw the seven seals. And we already passed the opening of the first six of the seventh, and now we come in Revelation chapter 8, when he opened the seventh seal. There was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Let me remind you, if you've come late into this program, in this teaching, we are now in the first part, 3.5 years, of the 7-year tribulation. In other words, Revelation chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 will bring us in this time frame period. In the 70th week of Daniel, so Revelation 4 to 11 will bring us here, because in the middle of the 7-year tribulation, which actually chapter 10, 11, 12 bring us to the middle of the 7-year tribulation, things will change drastically in the second part. Why? Because here we will have the Antichrist and we will have the false prophet doing what they are doing. So now, when we read in Revelation chapter 8, we are in this time frame period. You need to see it in Bible prophecy. You can't place it before, you can't place it in the church age, you can't place it in the second part, or even in the 1000th year. You need to understand the context. Revelation chapter 8 will be fulfilled during this period of time. The same for Revelation chapter 9. Very important, otherwise we misplace the scriptures where it should be in a correct place. So let's please read Revelation chapter 8. It's not a long chapter, just a few verses. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. Then another angel, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled with the fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the trees were burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. And a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. Then the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened. A third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. And I looked, and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. Incredible what's going to take place on the earth when we look at this chapter. Chapter 8 of Revelation introduces the 7 trumpets with the opening of the 7th seal. So we have 7 seals and the judgments on earth. We have the 7 trumpets and the judgments on earth. And we have the 7 bowls and their judgments on earth. And every time you will find 7, 7, 7. All 3 sevens take place in the 70th week, the 7-year week of prophecy of Daniel. 70th week, the 7th week in Bible prophecy, 7, 7, 7. Those periods of that 3 sevens will take place in a 7-year period, time frame. For us, it will take place after the rapture of the church, but before the second coming of Jesus Christ from heaven, before the 1,000-year reign of Christ. In other words, that 3 sevens will take place in this time frame period, after the rapture, but before the second coming of Jesus Christ from heaven. Okay, before the 1,000-year kingdom of peace. And so we are coming now to the second set of sevens. Revelation chapter 6 and 7 has brought us now to the first 7. And now, by reading here, we come to the 7th seal, which will then bring to the fore the 7 trumpets. Now, bear in mind that the 7 trumpets brings about, when the 7th seal is open, the 7 trumpets will bring the judgments, the holy, when they are sounded, they will bring the holy judgments of God on earth during the first 3.5-year period of the 7-year tribulation. Of course, looking at chapter 8, we've just read that there's only 4 trumpets, because chapter 9, we have the 5th and the 6th trumpet. And coming to later on Revelation 11 verse 15, we have the 7th trumpet. In other words, the 7 trumpets covers a period, Revelation chapter 8, Revelation chapter 9, Revelation chapter 10, Revelation chapter 11, until Revelation chapter 12, and also a period before the 7 bowls that we read in Revelation chapter 15 and 16. Just to place you in the chronological order of Bible prophecy. The first 4 trumpets, as we've seen here in Revelation chapter 8, will cause a partial ecological collapse on earth of the infrastructure and what's taking place on earth. Large numbers of people and animals will die as a result of these trumpets. In actual fact, when we get to chapter 9, we have the sounding of the 5th and 6th trumpet. Only 2 will fill the whole chapter, chapter 9, which will also be simultaneously the first 2 woes. And so we know because of this that it speaks of the authority of God, of the power of God, and of the judgment of God on earth as it will be revealed. So you need to understand something. This period of time in the world, nothing has ever existed. Since the days that God created Adam and Eve in the beginning of time, where we are at this very moment here at the end of the church age. So in this time frame period, from here, the Garden of Eden, from here, where Adam and Eve was, up to this point in time, covers now closely, rounded off a period of 6,000 years. So what we will see now is, we know what has taken place in that period of time, but now we move into this terrible time. And this terrible time that we read of, will only last for 7 years. So all these judgments will be fulfilled before the peace, before the kingdom of peace. First, the judgments of God. The 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. After the judgments, there will be peace on earth because Jesus will come. And after that, of course, the great white throne judgment, the final judgment, and we will move into the new heaven and the new earth. So, coming to verse 2, well, let me put it this way. Before I go to verse 2, I would just like to mention something. The fact that the Bible says there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Why? What's the reason that there's silence by the opening of the 7th seal? What do you think? Because the silence is not the content of the seal. That's not the content of the seal. But the silence in heaven is the forebode of the terrible contents of that seal. It is as if heaven realizes and are totally astounded and shocked by what is going to take place now on earth. God created the heavens and God created the earth, the seas and the ground. And what is going to take place here? People in heaven take note what's going to happen. And the meaning is very clear. A sacred silence precedes this terrible judgment that's going to follow. And the silence also testifies to the sympathy of the heavenly host with the inhabitants of the earth, knowing what's coming their way now. And the prologue to the terrible judgments which will follow under the sounding of the 7 trumpets is herewith portrayed graphically. This is what's going to happen now. So when the 7th seal is opened, 7 angels receive 7 trumpets. They will step forward. They stand before God. And because that's what we read in verse 2. I saw 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given, verse 2, 7 trumpets. In other words, they stand in the presence of God. So what is going to happen now on the earth, it's not because of nature, developments in nature. It's got nothing to do with a sun or a moon eclipse and like what we saw previously when the heavenly bodies move around in the sky around the earth. That is natural events. The fact that we see 7 angels standing in the presence of God, in the temple of God, they even before the throne of God, they come from God, means what's going to happen on earth, God is behind it all. So it's going to be supernatural. It's not natural events, it's supernatural. It is God dealing with mankind firsthand. So this is not per chance. This is God that's going to act. So these angels, the fact that they stand before God, we can understand also from It is God who will take action in the events to follow when they sound their trumpets. This is what's going to happen. And each one of them will receive their own trumpet. And these judgments that will take place at the sounding of these trumpets, we do understand will happen in the first 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation period. Very clearly. So, here it is, that when we ask ourselves the question, why trumpets? We know the reason for the silence, because of the terrible things that's going to take place with the inhabitants, mankind on earth. But why trumpets? Well, if you study the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 10, we can clearly see there's 3 reasons why Israel had trumpets, the people of the Lord, the holy nation of Israel. Number 1, firstly, the people were summoned to appear before God when the trumpet sounded. That you can clearly see from Numbers chapter 10, verse 1 to verse 8. So when the trumpets blow, they are calling the people to come together. It's a gathering of the people of the Lord to come together. This is one reason. The second reason why trumpet blow in verse 9, Numbers chapter 10, is because war was announced. It's a time of war. So the typical sounding of the trumpet will blow differently, different sounds when they call the people together. When it is a call of war, like the shofar that blow to announce it's wartime, it's a different blow of the trumpets. But then thirdly, in verse 10, we find that when there's special days, like special feasts and special occasions that are announced, that will take place, they would blow on the trumpet. So there's different reasons. In this instance, it is downright judgments of God. It's going to be war on the earth. There's going to be terrible things happening on earth. But before verse 7, when the first angel sounded his trumpet, there's still something else that takes place. Verse 3 to 5 explain to us that he saw angels, he saw golden censers, and he saw the altar of God before the throne. He saw the smoke of the incense. He heard the prayers of the saints. And so clearly he sees something happen in heaven, and then it struck him that the angel took the censer, filled it with fire, and hurled it on the earth. Why would he do that? And there's 4 things that attracts his attention, and I'll get to that in a moment. But listen to this. We know from Old Testament history that the golden censer from which the fragrance went up before God was normally placed in front of the most holy place of the tabernacle, and later on in the temple. Now, because the Lord will smell the incense and it will touch his heart dearly. And now we read there's an adding of incense to the prayers of the saints. And so this would indicate that under the 7th trumpet angels, that the prayers of the saints has been answered by God. Because they have been praying since Revelation chapter 6. If you study Revelation chapter 6, you will see how they pray before the altar of God in heaven, and they call on the Lord. And so their prayers of the saints to avenge their blood that was shed on earth, because they died as martyrs in this first time when the beginning of the 7-year tribulation. And all the people that have died and all the saints are calling on God, those that are now in heaven and those that are still on earth, that all the prayers of the saints are bringing before the Lord in remembrance. And what we can clearly see is the censer was filled with coals of fire. Now normally they would use the coals of fire from, they found it where the temple worship would take place, where the burnt offerings was, and that's where they found the coals. And so the incense was burnt on the fire of altar, resulting in a lovely fragrance which ascended to heaven, telling us that God will now remember the prayers of his saints. It is brought into God's remembrance. And of course, we also saw in Revelation 5 verse 8 that the elders and those that were before the throne of God, they did the same thing. It actually struck us very clearly in Revelation 5 verse 8. Now when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So this is not something new. This is what happens in heaven. And bringing this before the Lord means that God will remember now the prayers of his people. But what is amazing here is fire that is added to it, to the prayers, to the incense, and now taking that and hurling it to the earth, throwing it to the earth. So he's well aware that it's because of the fact that the prayers of the saints would give rise to the judgments and also the retribution on the inhabitants of the earth, because of the way the saints have been maltreated and caused great suffering to them. But the way God answers, it's what struck us. Because God's answer was to instruct the angel to empty the golden censer on the earth. Chuck it on the earth. So God judges now with fire. And that fire will be cast on the earth. And we can also see the moment when that happens, the moment when that incense and everything with fire is chucked on the earth, there's 4 things happening. There's 4, or can I say, there's a 4-fold consequence. Number 1, he heard voices. He says, when that happened, he says, there were, in verse 5, noises. It is, a better translation is, there was voices. It speaks of confusion, desperation, and anxiety taking place on earth, because the people are without answers of what's going on now on earth. What is going on earth now in this time frame period? Secondly, there's thunder or thunderings. It will sound like the rumbling of thunder on earth. And then there's a flashes of lightning, referring to the power and the might of God. And fourthly, an earthquake. The earth will be ripped open and shaken to its very foundation. This all is a prelude to what's going to happen when the 7 angels sound their trumpets. And so let's go to the first. Verse 7. The first angel sounded, and what we found here, now that they are ready to sound the trumpets, because in the previous verse they received the trumpets, which means they're going to act now. Angels are going to act now in a great way on the events that's going to take place on earth. Let me just make this comment. It is not something new. In Matthew chapter 13, and many other places, Matthew chapter 25, and even Revelation chapter 16, and many, many other places, we will find that angels are very much involved in events on the earth at the end time. Okay. Here's the first trumpet, hail and fire. On the third, and we see here, 1/3 of the dry surface of the earth will be destroyed by the judgment of hail and fire mixed with blood. So what happens is the moment that the first trumpet sounds on earth, 1/3 of, look very clearly what the text says in verse 7, and 1/3 of the earth, of hail and blood that was thrown on the earth, 1/3 of the trees were burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. You need to take note of what's happening here. The plague is literal, just as was happened in the days of the Egyptians and Moses. I mean, Exodus chapter 9 says, when Moses stretched out his staff towards the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back on earth. That happened literally in the days of Moses when Israel was in Egypt. And so now what we see here is 1/3 of the livelihood on earth, the fruit of the trees, the fruit of the trees is there for man and for beasts to eat. And 1/3 of all the food on the trees of the earth, 1/3 is gone. And the grass, all green grass is gone. So the food of the animals has been taken away. So something huge is going to take place now because the green grass is for cattle. And it will be destroyed by this plague of the first trumpet. What is amazing is during the third day of creation, God bring forth trees, fruit, plants, seed, and green grass. That happened on the third day of creation. Now, 1/3 of all of that is destroyed with this plague. 1/3 of all of that. So it will be an ecological collapse on the earth with disastrous results for man and beast. Think for yourself. If 1/3 of all the food on all the trees in the whole world disappears overnight, it's gone, it is destroyed. What's going to happen? It will bring a huge famine on the earth. Now the second trumpet sounded, and this time a huge mountain ablaze. That is what he saw. And remember, the first trumpet bring hail and fire. In other words, from the sky, hail and fire rain down on the surface of the earth. And as hail and fire of the first trumpet rain down, it destroys 1/3 of all the trees, all the fruit, everything on earth, and all the grass is burnt away. Terrible what's happened. And following that, there's something else falling from heaven. What is falling now, when the second trumpet sound, he says, I saw a great mountain. I saw something like a great mountain, a huge mountain. So clearly the scripture says, John says, something like a huge mountain all ablaze. And it fall in the sea, on the rivers and the springs of water. He says, it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. So all of this will have a huge impact, because he says what he saw is because of that the water become poisonous. You can't drink fresh water. So 1/3 of all the fresh water on the earth, of the fountains and the springs of the earth, 1/3 on the whole earth is destroyed. People will be looking for water. And when they do find water, it is poisonous. It is bitter. And so there's a few things happening here. Number one, of course, he says also that 1/3 of the creatures will die in the waters, but also many men will die, verse 11, from the water, because it was made bitter. So if you drink that water, you die. It's poisonous water. Actually, the name of the star means it's actually to bring healing, but in this instance, because God is judging, it brings death. And this burning meteorite that will struck the earth, or part of a comet, when it comes into the earth, it will bring, of course, terrible judgments, because what we also see here is it has huge devastation on earth, because looking at the second and the third trumpet together, the one touches the sea, it becomes 1/3 of the sea blood. The others touches the fresh water. So when the second and the third trumpet, when that takes place, the one struck the seas of the earth, the other struck the fresh water, all the rivers of the earth. So what you see is, when it struck the sea, especially the Mediterranean Sea, 1/3 of all the ships, because of the tsunamis, and that is what it clearly says. It says, so 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea die, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. So in other words, ships, 1/3 of all the ships. Can you think of the economical downturn in the world if 1/3 of all the ships sank in the sea? What's going to happen? All the oil and all the precious cargo that's on the ships. 1/3 of all the ships in the sea is gone. Secondly, 1/3 of everything in the sea die, but also in the fresh water, that will die. So the star that falls from heaven, the meteorite, not only it will hit the sea, but it will also touches the fresh water on the earth. And this, of course, will have a huge impact on mankind. Because now, how will you drink if you don't have water? What will you eat if there's no fruit on the trees? It reminds us of Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 15. I will make the people eat bitter fruit and drink poisonous water. The Lord prophesied that. One day it will happen. So what is amazing here, I want you to think for a moment about this. The water supply of the earth will be affected on a wide front with catastrophic results for mankind. This is what's coming. So life will become very hard in the days of the 7-year tribulation. And then we have the last trumpet that is sounded, and this is verse 12. And when the 4th angel sounded, the 1/3 of the sun was struck, 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars. So the 1/3 of them were darkened, and 1/3 of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. So light will be restricted for mankind, because this judgment destroys 1/3 of light. And 1/3 of the sun, the moon, and the stars will be restricted from shining on the earth. In other words, it can become on certain places on the earth unbearably cold. Can you imagine if 1/3 of the heat of the sun is taken away from earth? What's going to happen? Take away 1/3 of the heat of the sun of the earth. It will become very cold, very icy, very dead. There's no fresh water to drink. 1/3 of the water is gone. The fruit trees, 1/3 of all the trees is destroyed. The cattle can't eat. 1/3 of the grass is destroyed on earth. Now, there's a third less daylight. 4 hours less daylight. And 4 hours less night. And of course, it will be a terrible thing. Literally, there will be 4 hours less daylight as people experience it. So the question is, life on earth, how will it be? It will be very difficult, very unpleasant. And so there will be exceptional hardship and suffering for people that live in this time frame period on earth. You don't have an idea what is coming. I'm talking about this period in human history. Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 21, verse 20 and 21, that this 7-year or this tribulation, it has never existed since man was created on earth, and it will never ever after this for all eternity ever be on earth again. This is unequal of any other time, this time frame period. And now lastly, we have verse 13 in closing. And I looked and I heard an angel flying through the midst of the heavens, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to inhabitants of the earth because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound. So here's an angel, God sends an angel flying in the midst of the air over the earth, making this announcement. And of course, the fact that God do something like this explained to us the seriousness of the terrible consequences of the coming judgments of God on earth that still remain. In other words, what we have just heard up to now in all these chapters of Revelation is just a prelogue of what's going to happen now, coming to the middle and lastly to the second part of the 7-year tribulation. What is amazing is that this threefold woe, it is a heart-rendering announcement, because the 3 woes, when that takes place on earth, that will follow with an unleash of the most terrible events ever taken place on earth. And that will take place with the last 3 trumpets. By studying the last 3 trumpets, the last 3 woes, we realize that all 3 woes contain demonic influences. What's going to happen on earth now? It's going to be demonic. Up to now, the first 4 trumpets, it touches the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and it touches the water and the sea and the land and the trees and the inhabitants on the earth and the ships on the earth and life on earth. But now, coming to number 5, 6, and 7, it's all demonic, devilish. As you study them in Revelation chapter 9 and the Revelation chapter 12, there's no other way to understand it, because the demonic influence of demons and fallen angels on mankind, that's going to unleash a lot of evil, suffering, and death as there never was since man has been on earth. So here's the 3 woes. The first woe, which is the 5th trumpet, which we will see next time in the Revelation chapter 9, unleash demonic grasshoppers coming from the bottomless pit, from the abyss. In other words, when the 5th trumpet sound in this time frame period, in the 7 year, what will happen is the abyss will open up. And when the abyss open up, it means that the creatures that are in here, demonic forces, demons, fallen angels, and especially demons, it will open up the abyss and they will come out to the surface of the earth. And they will bring great suffering to mankind. For 5 months, they will bring great pain and suffering to mankind. Then, when the 6th trumpet sound, the second woe will take place, and that, in the second part of Revelation 9, unleash demonic horsemen from the bottomless pit, and they will bring death and destruction on mankind. And lastly, the third woe, when the 7th trumpet sound, it will be the final expulsion from Satan with his fallen angels from heaven. What you see here, in the 3rd heaven, we have the principalities and powers of darkness, the rulers of the air. And here above the earth, we have war in heaven, where the dragon and his angels will be cast out of the heavens, and they will be cast onto earth for 3.5 years, for the latter part, for the second part, the latter part of the 7-year tribulation. In other words, this war, where all the fallen angels and the Satan himself will be cast on earth, means they can't go back into 2nd heaven, into the sky, or even go to 3rd heaven. It's impossible, because God has, through his angels, cast them out permanently on earth. And being here, can you just imagine what they will unleash on mankind in that part? In other words, we are talking about this part now. When the 7th trumpet sound, what will happen in the middle of the week, where all demonic forces, all fallen angels and the devil will be on earth for this time and a half a time, or the last 3.5 years. So, and of course, this will bring the world into final preparation for the second part of the Great Tribulation. And we know then the kingdom of Jesus will be ushered in. Because after this, thank God, this only lasts for 7 years. 1,260 days, 1,260 days. When this 7 years is passed, we will go into the 1,000-year peace. And this will be something of the past. But for the world, untold misery of evil and violence, death and destruction, suffering and sorrow will be brought to them when these woes come to bring destruction on the earth like never before, never experienced before. You know, it reminds me of Jesus' own words in Matthew 24, verse 22. Jesus, referring to this time period in the world to come, he says, if those days, Jesus says, had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. So my friends, next time when we look at Revelation chapter 9, we will come to the 5th and the 6th trumpet when they sound. God bless you.